We have a great morning planned today, and we're going to start that off with a panel on Iran after the elections. I'm going to introduce briefly Barbara Slavin, who is the Assistant Managing Editor for World and National Security at the Washington Times, and she's the author of a 2007 book on Iran entitled Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. Prior to joining the Times in July 2008, she was a senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, and her bio notes that as part of her research on Iran, she's visited Iran 7 times. So I think she's a great person to moderate this opening panel. I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce the panelists.
Good morning. Let me thank the Foreign Policy Initiative for inviting me. I'll just make a couple of very brief remarks, and then we'll start out with our panel. On Friday, Iran witnessed more massive popular demonstrations in the aftermath of their disputed June presidential elections. And for those of you who were able to catch a glimpse of these on television or YouTube or Facebook, I think they were definitive proof that a movement that burst into public consciousness on June the 13th is by no means dissipated. I think many of us would argue that it's actually deepening its roots in Iranian society as a result of the harsh crackdown that took place against previous protests. This movement is spreading from Tehran to Isfahan, Shiraz, and other major cities. And for the first time since the 1979 revolution, the Iranian diaspora is linking up again with Iranians in Iran against their own government. This is a great week to be talking about Iran. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is coming to the UN yet again. This is his 5th visit. But he's going to be met this time, I think, by even larger protests than he has in the past by the sisters, cousins, brothers, and children of Iranians in Iran. They're all protesting election fraud. They're demanding democratic change in the Islamic Republic. And it's ironic that just as this is all gathering in Iran, we have a U.S. administration that has come into office advocating engagement without preconditions with Iran. To discuss the situation and what the U.S. should do, what our options are, we've got a great panel. One of them is late, but we'll start with 2 that are here. Let me introduce them all at once, and then I think for many of you they are familiar. We'll start with Ray Take, who will be our first speaker. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, the author of several books, including Hidden Iran, Paradox and Power in the Islamic Republic, and most recently, The Guardians of the Revolution, Iran's Approach to the World, which I highly recommend. Ray had a brief stint in the Obama administration as senior advisor to Dennis Ross, who was special advisor for the Gulf and Southwest Asia at the State Department. He's now got a new title, but I'm not sure what it is. Ray is a contributing editor to The National Interest. He's had articles published in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Washington Quarterly, World Policy Journal, and other major publications. After Ray, we will have Roel Mark Gerecht, who is a senior fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He focuses on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, and intelligence. Roel's the author of Know Thine Enemy, A Spy's Journey into Revolutionary Iran, and The Islamic Paradox, Shiite Clerics, Sunni Fundamentalists, and the Coming of Arab Democracy. He's also contributing editor for the Weekly Standard, a correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly, and a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other publications. And much of his expertise on these matters he gathered when he was a specialist with the CIA's Directorate of Operations. And then finally, we should be joined soon, hopefully, by Karim Sajapur, who is an associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to that, he spent 4 years as the chief Iran analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Tehran and Washington. He's a leading researcher on Iran. He's done numerous interviews with Iranian officials, businessmen, ordinary folks. He's a regular contributor to the BBC, CNN, NPR, and PBS. He's written for The Economist, Washington Post, New York Times, etc., and he's frequently quoted by journalists, yours among them myself and many others. And he wrote a particularly good analysis earlier this year about Ayatollah Khamenei and his role in Iran. And with that, I think we'll turn things over to the panel, and I'll ask Ray to start.
Do you want me to go over there? Thanks. I'll just spend a few minutes trying to sort of outline how Iran's internal political situation is changing and what that portends for its foreign policy and whatever options there are to deal with rather recalcitrant theocracy. I think Iran today, in terms of its internal political dynamics, has to be viewed as a country in transition. How it's going to make that transition or where it's going to end up is difficult to say. I think for the moment and for the immediate future, the regime has succeeded in suppressing popular unrest. I don't know if if its security forces have the strategic depth to suppress a nationwide movement for a protracted period of time, but so long as the opposition is episodic and sporadic, then I think they can probably manage the situation, at least for the immediate future. Far more serious in terms of the immediate problems that the regime faces is a serious and, in my view, an unbridgeable elite fragmentation. There are many former members of the elite that are now separating themselves from the regime. I think presidential candidate Karoubi did that in 2005. I think Mr. Khatami is doing that now. And soon, I think other members will eventually get to that point. Both the opposition, if you want to call it that, and those in power have a plan B, which they are loath, I think, to exercise. Plan B for the regime would be a very serious suppression of domestic political opponents and a very serious purge resembling the 1980s. You know, not just public recantations, but executions and so on and so forth. And I think there's some degree of reluctance on their part to do that. And there's certainly some degree of reluctance on part of the supreme leader to do that, but I think there are members of the governing class, President Ahmadinejad, those who are eager to do it, just complete purge of the political system and reducing Iran to a single political tendency, establishing its complete hegemony. The opposition has a plan B, if you would. The plan B would be actually no longer calling for the reform of the movement, for the system, but actually overthrowing it. And they also seem reluctant to do that. So at this point, you have this sort of an internal stalemate with more movement on the conservative side in a sense that they're likely to move in a more direction of purges, but those purges are likely to be less systematic than they desire. So we're dealing with a country that's in a serious degree of political internal ferment. What that means for its foreign policy is very difficult to say. President Ahmadinejad has one of two options, two directions he can go. The first direction would be whether he recognizes that he actually does have a problem, in a sense that he has a lack of domestic support and perhaps some degree of crisis of legitimacy. I actually think his political acumen is sufficient enough to recognize that he has a problem. He can try to compensate for that internal legitimacy crisis by seeking foreign policy achievement abroad. Often when presidents are in trouble at home, they seek success abroad. If that's the direction that he would go, then you will see a more accommodating foreign policy in the near future. The second direction he can go is externalization of his internal problems. Namely, in order to have a purge, in order to consolidate his power completely, he can actually suggest that his domestic enemies are agents of foreign powers and so forth. And if that's the direction that they're going to, then it's likely to be a foreign policy of confrontation as opposed to accommodation, because you need an external enemy to justify internal repression. It'll probably more be a variation of Plan B, where the regime is likely to engage in that degree of externalization of its domestic problems. However, given the international scrutiny of its nuclear infractions and given the sanctions and so forth that are being contemplated, it is likely to have some degree of tactical dexterity, which means it will participate in international forums, it will participate in international discussions, but it is loath to make concessions on critical issues of national security once it gets to those. So there will be some degree of participation and engagement with the international community, but not necessarily offering sort of concessions. So essentially, it'll be negotiations that are likely, from their perspective, to be designed to procrastinate, delay, sort of punt the ball down the street. October 1st, I think there's a first meeting of 5+1 with Iranian representatives. It is an interesting meeting because almost no one has high hopes for it. The Iranian negotiators have been very clear. I think Saeed Jalili was very clear yesterday, I believe, in his press conference, that they intend to discuss their proposal. Their proposal has its share of sort of absurdities and nonsense. Iranian proposals are usually product of, interagency committee group, which means all the bad ideas from everywhere come together in one place. So in that particular sense, you see aspects of this. And if you look at the proposals from 2006, 2008, 2009, there's a sort of an evolutionary path, and they become less precise, less forthcoming, and more, I guess the word is utopic, in a sense, seeking global justice, global non-proliferation regime, and so on and so forth, and not necessarily discussing Iran's own infractions and violations. So what are the options? I'll briefly go through them before turning it over to Ruel. The options are the options. They're well known. They haven't really gotten better. As a matter of fact, in every sense, they've gotten worse. My time frame for discussing the options will be between now and spring or summer, because I think in spring or summer, the Israelis will have to make some critical decisions about how they want to approach this issue, militarily or acquiescence. That's usually the time frame that is being contemplated. Between now and then, if you continue to pursue an engagement policy, which I think at least at some level is going to be the case, it is unlikely that there will be a negotiated settlement or significant progress in the negotiations on this issue. If you're looking at engagement as a sort of a multi-year process, where you sort of gradually chip at the ice while they continue to accumulate nuclear technologies and nuclear resources, and you're willing to accept that in the hope that after several years of negotiations, you have built up sufficient confidence, there have been some degree of evolutionary changes within the regimes, its internal complexion will somehow change, and therefore you can have some sort of an accommodation with it. Or at the end of that multi-year process, it's entirely possible you'll have no accommodation and you're left with a country that has a significant nuclear apparatus and which is unregulated. But that's if you're looking at engagement policy, you have to look at it as a long-term process and an exercise in speculation with no guarantees of success. In a short term, between now and summer or even beyond, it is unlikely that the engagement policy will move beyond set speeches. Iranians will give their speeches, the international partners will give their speeches. It's possible there'll be a sidebar at the discussions. I'm not quite sure if that's going to dramatically change the nature of the conversation. But, it'll be some sort of a possibly variation of the six-party talks that took place with North Korea, where you have the international forum, but within that you have a more bilateral conversation taking place. But again, that's unlikely to produce the kind of results that one is looking for in that sense. The other option would be, some sort of a containment regime that is applied to Iran, but the containment regime doesn't deal with your nuclear problem. It essentially stipulates a failure and seeks to contain increasingly a nuclear-armed Iran. And I don't think that's where everybody is. So everybody's trying to still resolve somehow the nuclear problem, why containment is an acquiescence. And I also don't know how containment works in the context of Iran, because Iran is a different country than the Soviet Union. Containment in this particular case would involve efforts to prevent Iran from having more influence in its neighboring states, not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but the Gulf states, where they are supporting a variety of opposition groups. So it would have to do with some hard work in terms of institutional building, strengthening the military capabilities of these regimes, attenuating Iran's links with Hezbollah and Hamas, which essentially means some degree of movement on the Palestinian-Israeli front, Lebanese front. So it's a fairly arduous task. It doesn't, I mean, often we think of containment as sort of military deployments on the periphery of Iran, a la the Soviet Union. That's, as a matter of fact, in many ways, that's counterproductive because it leads to a more visible and American presence, which has political complications for the neighboring states. Also, given the conventional balance of power, Iran would be further inclined toward this nuclear program to offset the imbalance in conventional forces. So containment has to be thought of in a very creative, imaginative way as applied to the peculiarities of the Gulf and the peculiarities of Iran and the way Iran projects its power, which is through soft power, which is through subversion, terrorism, and links with like-minded, primarily but not exclusively Shi'i political parties, and how you deal with that will be difficult. Also, containment essentially means you have some degree of instability in the neighboring states, and particularly in Afghanistan, which is now on rather dire straits. I'll say a few things about a military strike, Israeli military strike. I have absolutely no idea whether they're going to do it or not. I mean, I just simply don't know. People who understand their anatomy suggest to me they're quite serious. They seem to suggest they're quite serious. They seem to suggest they have the logistical capability of doing it. I don't know if it's going to be effective. I don't know if it's going to, what the ramifications of that are for Iran's internal political system, ramifications are for in terms of Iranian regional retaliation. I think Iranians will retaliate directly against Israel because otherwise you look like Syria. You know, you have grandiose rhetoric and passivity in face of external attack. And that has an escalatory dynamic potentially built into it. Israelis retaliate and so on. Likely to be retaliation against the United States. I don't think that needs to be exaggerated. I don't think Iraq and Afghanistan will go to hell and haywire and all that stuff. The stability of Iraq and Afghanistan are in Iran's own parochial national interests. But nevertheless, there has to be some thought about what the first week, what the first month, what the first 6 months after a prospective Israeli strike look like. I think Israelis will have to make a number of decisions, and those decisions are going to be predicated on certain factors. Number one, whether the international sanctions regime that is being contemplated has had an impact on Iran's nuclear deliberations. I would say it will not. Between now and summer, the sanctions regime as being contemplated will not measurably affect Iran's behavior, not just because the Russians and the Chinese won't agree to it. Even if they agree to it and you have a more multilateralized, robust regime, this is an Iranian regime that has subordinated economics to strategy. So they're willing to take the price of economic sanctions and international program in order to advance their foreign policy objectives. So sanctions as such simply are not going to work. Usually the discussion is, well, if the Chinese and the Russians support us, we'll have measurable sanctions. I don't think that's going to happen. I also don't think, at the end of the day, the Russians and the Chinese are going to sign up to those sanctions anyways. The argument is if the United States tried hard and failed in engagement, then the Chinese and the Russians will sign on. That argument has never made any sense to me because they have certain relationships with Iran that they value, and they're not going to abandon those relationships because we tried really hard. So the utility and viability of the sanctions regime is something that the Israelis will take into consideration. The viability of diplomacy in terms of resolving this issue, it is unlikely to do so. The advancement in Iran's program, particularly with the introduction of new generation of centrifuges and accumulation of low and enriched uranium. That combination essentially lessens the time for a breakout. And they will have to take into consideration and how hard the facilities are and their own logistical capability. What they come out at the end of that is I have no idea. I really don't have any viable solutions to the Iranian conundrum. So I'm not quite sure if there's a sort of a stentorian way I can end this discussion, other than saying uneasy lies ahead. Thank you.
Try to keep it a little shorter.
Since Barbara stole my watch, I may be a tad bit loquacious, but I'll try to control myself.
I'll give it back to you.
It's not my fault. Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Since June 12th and Ray's service in the U.S. government, brief service in the U.S. government, I think we found ourselves in near agreement. So I don't think it's necessary for me to go over many of the things that Ray talked about because, again, I think we're largely on the same sheet of music. I will just mention a few things. One, I think engagement is toast. It was always toast. But I think there was a certain optimism in certain quarters, particularly on the left, believing that somehow engagement might just barely be possible. I think it was an aftershock of President Bush. But I think June 12th decisively buried that. However, I don't think the administration has any place to go. I mean, they could, for example, become much more aggressive in their rhetoric. They could back the democratic movement, at least rhetorically. But I think that's almost impossible for them. I'm very skeptical that can happen. I think President Obama will start hearing the echo of President Bush in his ear. And I just don't see this administration becoming a great advocate of democracy in the region and strongly supporting the democratic movement. Again, it's possible. I mean, if you go back and look at the president's Cairo speech, there were certainly democratic moments in that speech, and it's possible he could pivot. But to do that would also make him marry on to a very aggressive sanctions regime. And I'm still somewhat skeptical that the administration is going to do that. I know that Secretary of State Clinton has said that the very tough sanctions are on the way, but I'm not convinced of that. I think if the administration were bright, they'd certainly marry up with French President Sarkozy and see if they could challenge the Europeans and lead the Europeans in a very, very rigorous sanctions regime. But I'm in a complete agreement with Ray, and we've been in agreement, I think, on this one for years, that for the Iranians, this really is, the nuclear weapon program is really the issue for them. And I would add a religious dimension for them. I think it has to do with their very identity of being revolutionary Shiites. I don't think they're going to relent. And the only conceivable way that they might is if you hit them with a really tidal wave of sanctions. And I just don't see that. I mean, for this to be effective, we'd have to guilt trip and coerce the Europeans in a rather profound way. I don't think the administration wants to do that. That would entail them being much rougher than the Bush administration or any administration has ever been. I think the Germans in particular will fight it. The Italians will fight it. And I just don't see this tug of war coming out in the direction of really severe sanctions, at least that have the type of bite that you could say, all right, maybe the clerical regime will relent. Though I think it's worthwhile to try that. And again, I think that's the best option. I don't think, for example, the administration is going to obviously go in a covert direction. I'm very, very skeptical and always have been that there are many covert options for the United States vis-a-vis Iran. It's not 1953 anymore. Back then, you could literally have a room this size and everybody of importance in Tehran could fit into it. The regime is much more massive now, and the United States has no abilities whatsoever. That's not to say that you shouldn't support democratic movements, and I think that's a basic ethical decision. If you were to have Iranian dissidents and others come to us and say, would you clandestinely support us, I would say yes. I think they certainly deserve the same type of support that we gave to Eastern Europeans during the Soviet period. And if you go back and look, you could certainly make an argument that much of that support was not all that valuable. However, I think you should do it. You never know. And certainly they should be no morally different than Poles, Czechs, or Hungarians. So if they do come forward, and I would just mention, this is also somewhat of an intelligence issue. It is entirely possible that as the regime continues to boil, and I would just add on to what Ray said, I don't think the regime ever gets to go back, and I think the troubles are only going to get worse. You cannot hurt the number of children and members of the elite as this regime has done and expect it to ever go away. You cannot hurt the families as they have done. And I will just underscore, the clerical families probably produce the best educated children in Iran. I have no way of knowing, but I'm willing to guess that the children of the senior clerical families are overwhelmingly in favor of reform or overwhelmingly in favor of Mousavi. And I'm even willing to make a further guess and say that probably a significant number of children of the senior members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps are too. They are also amongst the best educated, and there is one way you can divide, I think, the movements in Iran, and that is those who are very well educated and those who are not. Those who are educated tend to support the Mousavi wing. And that's simplifying it a great deal, but I think that split holds. So I don't think this goes away. I think it only gets worse. I think it is highly likely, as it gets worse, that the regime will become a lot nastier overseas. I think you can counter this. Whether we are willing to do so is a different issue. I'm somewhat skeptical. I mean, for example, if you were to imagine a Hobart Towers 2, which I think is not all that unlikely. I think it's entirely possible that the regime could do it. What would be the American response? I mean, that's a difficult question. Are you going to, you have the option of trying to ignore it. We've gone that route before. Would you want to respond? If you do respond, are you willing to take the escalation that may arrive? And then that gets obviously into a military question of whether we even have the resources to handle that. We are, I think it need to say, having a great deal of difficulty militarily handling a fading insurgency in Iraq and a growing insurgency in Afghanistan. So it's not clear to me that the United States is going to want to aggressively actually handle any type of Iranian mischief, which I think is, again, unfortunately, a growing possibility. Now, again, I agree completely with Ray. This is a very, very difficult situation. I don't see right now any way out of this for the United States. It's just inconceivable in my mind right now that the Obama administration, of course, would engage in a preemptive strike. I suppose if you were to have, for example, a Hobart Towers 2 before the Iranians actually got a nuke, that then it might be possible for the United States to respond and say, all right, we've got a regime that's engaged in terrorism actively against us now. There's no way on God's earth we're going to let them get nukes. I think that it's becoming more likely. I've always been skeptical about that the Israelis were going to strike. However, if this administration could do anything to make that possibility greater, they're doing it. And the way that they're handling the Israeli-Palestinian issue vis-a-vis the Iranian question has truly been lame. I think their actions here are intensifying the distaste in Israel for American policy and the general impression that it's no longer serious. So I think the odds are going up that the Israelis will strike. Again, I think the ultimate question for the Israelis now is not whether it's really going to anger the United States. I think the ultimate question for the Israelis is, have they waited too long? And are they willing to take the repercussions from it? I suspect answer to the latter question is yes. I don't know the answer to the first one. But that will be a clarifying moment, I have to say. I mean, if the Israelis do strike, we will get to see, for example, are the Iranians capable, really, of calling upon their allies that they have supported all these years? Does the relationship with the Hezbollah really mean anything? Does their ecumenical outreach, which the clerical regime has worked strenuously since the revolution with Islamic militants, does all that investment in these folks, does it matter? Will they be able to, if the Israelis strike, will they rise forth and actually, engage in terrorism, launch missiles, et cetera, against the Israelis? I'm not so sure that's true. I think the Iranian capacity to strike in Iraq is actually quite limited now. I think they're in trouble. As the Shia in Iraq have grown in power and authority, as Najaf has revived itself, and it has revived itself enormously. Anyone who's been to Najaf in the not-too-distant past knows how vibrant that place has become. I think the Iranians have real limitations on striking out against the Americans in Iraq. I think in Afghanistan the situation is even worse. If they can really hurt us in Afghanistan, they should get an award. I think we have other things to worry about in Afghanistan, and the Iranians would just be one little addition to our problems there. I'm very skeptical that, and it's not clear to me how the Iranians read this. I think 2 years ago, for example, when we were talking about how much trouble we were in, they were then repeating it and reminding us of how much trouble we were in. It's not so clear now. So I'm not sure where the Israelis go. I have no idea on that, but I do think the odds are going up. But I think it's also important to remember that the situation for the Iranians is not so hot anymore, that they are not 10 feet tall. I would argue they're not even 7 feet tall. And the situation inside of the country has greatly complicated their lives. I think it's made them fundamentally, they've always been an insecure regime. They've been a very strong regime, much stronger in most ways than, for example, the Shahs, but they've always psychologically feared the unexpected spark. The first time it happened was after Khomeini died. It had to do with a soccer riot in Tehran in 1989. And ever since then, they've built up a very impressive security apparatus, which now has, Robocops all over the place. But it's fundamentally reflective of a deep insecurity in the regime. I think this has only gotten worse. So it's not clear to me at all how the regime would handle and react to, for example, an Israeli strike. That they would have to react, they certainly would. I'm sure they would use terrorism, but their capacity to hit, I'm not so certain about. But I'll just end there and just say that, again, the Obama administration, I think it has itself in a real pickle. It has defined itself really by engagement. I think it's now very, very difficult for it to let go, even though it has no hope. And I think, I'll defer to Ray, but I suspect certainly Dennis Ross and others, I think, are not terribly optimistic and are beginning to have maybe even realized that engagement is counterproductive. It is certainly counterproductive for the dissidents inside of the country. I would argue it's counterproductive if you believe that sanctions are the way to go. It's counterproductive for the Europeans. If we are really serious about trying to get sanctions in order, we have to do it now. I think you have to set up a very firm timeline now and say, all right, after this date, after the meeting on the 1st of October, no more. Let's seriously get down to business. And then we're just going to run the clock out. And we're going to see whether the Israelis are going to strike or not. And if they're not, then, I don't know, do we raise the white flag? I'm not sure what we do. I'm not sure where containment goes. I'm still waiting for someone to explain containing Iran to me. I'm sure it's possible. I just haven't figured out quite how yet. That's it.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good morning to you all. I was telling a colleague of mine, it's funny how Iran has turned all of us into neocons in some way. When the Obama administration first took office last January, like every think tanker in town, I had to write a full memo to the president and advising him what he should do vis-a-vis Iran. And I said that there's a fundamental question which needs to be probed. It's fundamental but quite facile, and that is, why does Iran behave the way it does? Are Iranian policies a reaction to punitive U.S. measures, as was thought to be the case largely during the Bush administration? Iran is simply reacting to the hardline approach of Bush-Cheney. Or are Iranian policies driven by this immutable revolutionary ideology, which was born in 1979, and the regime is really incapable of changing? I think the last 9 months, and especially the last 3 months, have answered that question for us. The first 6 months of the Obama administration, from January till June, I don't think anyone can question whether the United States made sincere overtures to Iran, both publicly in terms of the Nowruz message, the president's inauguration speech, and privately in terms of the letters to the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. So what I would like to talk broadly about kind of the internal dynamics and also about the state of the opposition. But what I would say is that I thought Ray and Ruel was spot on a lot of points. What I would say about myself is that what I've learned from the last few months, in the last 9 months, is that I'm far more cynical about the Iranian regime, but I'm far more optimistic about the prospects for change than I was, say, prior to these elections. So just a few lessons from the last few months, both in terms of the regime and the opposition. The first point is that what I would argue is that the underlying problem we have with Iran has to do with the character of this regime, not its nuclear ambitions. What that means is that as long as Ahmadinejad remains president, and namely Ayatollah Khamenei remains supreme leader, there's no deal in the works. We're never going to reach a nuclear accord whereby we sign a sheet of paper with the Iranians which allays our suspicions, and namely Israel's suspicions, that Iran has abandoned its weapons ambitions and Iran is amenable to playing a more constructive role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So basically the problem is the regime, not the nuclear ambitions. I would argue that the policy at the moment focuses on Iran's nuclear ambitions, not the regime. But we can get back to that. In terms of where the regime is at, the last 3 decades, the Islamic Republic has had a fairly simple political nomenclature. They said there's khodis and ghayr khodis. It means there's insiders and there's outsiders. The insiders were individuals who subscribed to the Khomeini system of government. If not 100%, broadly speaking, there were individuals who shared this belief in an Islamic Republic. And the outsiders were, I would argue, the majority of the country, who were either more secular orientation or more liberal Shiite or not Shiite. And what's transpired the last 4 years under Ahmadinejad, but has especially been amplified the last 3 months, is that the insiders have shrunk to, I would argue, not only a narrow swath of the Iranian public, but a very narrow swath of the political elite as well. Someone like Mohammad Khatami, who not long ago was receiving 80% of the popular vote, 24 million votes, I believe, in 2001, 22 million votes in 1997, is now frequently being written in hardline newspapers as a traitor. There's a lot of talk of even the prospect of him being arrested. Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of the pillars of the revolution in 1979, is openly being talked about as a traitor. Mehdi Karroubi, Speaker of the Parliament, also a pillar of the 1979 revolution, being talked about his imminent arrest as well. So the insiders in the Islamic Republic have shrunk to what I would describe as a cartel of hardline clergymen and nouveau riche revolutionary guardsmen. And again, the outsiders have become the vast majority of what was then the political elite. And it's created bridges between Iranians in Iran, Iranians amongst the political elite in Iran, and the Iranians and the diaspora, which is unprecedented, which I've never seen the last 3 decades. People who would want nothing to do with someone like me, say 2-3 years ago, are now in regular contact. A second lesson from the last 3 months, I would argue, is that this regime is incredibly odious, but it's not suicidal. In fact, it desperately wants to stay in power. It ruthlessly wants to stay in power. And it calibrated its force to that accord. It didn't come down. It was severely brutal, and it used draconian punishments. But it calibrated its use of force. The point I'm trying to make is that we can get to this in policy options, but an argument I often hear from Israelis is that this regime is messianic, it's irrational, therefore it's undeterrable. I think that there's a distinction between being odious and being irrational, and I do think it is deterrable because these folks desperately want to stay in power. Now, a word about the Obama administration's approach and engagement. I actually think that the first 6 months of the Obama administration, the Obama presidency, the policy measures taken were very important. And in a way, I would argue, go so far as to say that it had a role in what's transpired the last few months, in the sense that these overtures towards Iran accentuated the internal rifts amongst Iranian elites, and it accentuated the rift between the population and the regime. Whereas I think some of the policies during the Bush administration kind of united Iran's disparate political factions against a common threat. Again, these overtures made it very difficult for the hardliners in Tehran to justify their continued enmity towards the United States. And not long ago, about 5 months ago, not long after Obama's Nowruz speech to the Iranians, I saw a fairly senior conservative Iranian official, a close advisor to Ali Larijani, at a meeting in the Middle East. And he said to me something quite interesting. He said he was trying to say that these overtures were unsettling the regime and putting a lot of pressure on the hardliners. And he said, listen, if we can't make nice with Barack Hussein Obama, who is preaching mutual respect on a weekly basis and sending us Nowruz greetings, it's pretty clear to all that the problem lies in Tehran, not Washington. And I think that you had many of the elite who had already reached this conclusion or did reach this conclusion. And again, I think it became very obvious to the Iranian public as well that the problem is their regime, not the United States. Now, a word about the opposition. As I said, I actually am more optimistic about the prospects for some type of change. I'm not predicting a revolution. I'm not predicting any change necessarily in the near term. But I've noticed that others are quite skeptical or cynical about the prospects for change. And one thing that's been interesting for me is going back, reading the histories of the revolution in 1979. And if you look back at 1979, it took about 6 months before 1 million people took to the streets. This time it happened within 1 week. 3 million people took to the streets about a week after the elections. And this number of 3 million is attributed to the mayor of Tehran, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. This was, right after people were told that they're forbidden to protest and they risk the wrath of the regime. And they've continued to go out to the streets, most recently last Friday on Jerusalem Day. In terms of kind of the strategy, if there is one, of the opposition, what they're doing is taking a decidedly deliberate approach in the sense that they're trying to build kind of a critical mass under the tent of what they call the Green Movement or the opposition. And that means trying to pick off as many Revolutionary Guardsmen, senior clergymen as possible under this critical mass, and then move forward all together as a group rather than making very strident statements but being smaller in number. Now, there haven't been, the word inqilab, revolution, I have not heard used. And I don't think anyone is talking about some type of a wholesale change of the system, but simply the disempowerment of the unelected institutions, namely the institution of the Supreme Leader, institutions like the Guardian Council, and the empowerment of the elected institutions like the presidency, like the parliament. The opposition faces difficult obstacles at the moment. Their brain trust is either in prison, under house arrest, or unable to freely communicate. And I think another parallel with 1979, which doesn't fit, is the fact that, whereas in 1979 the bulk of the Shah's elite spend their formative years, many of them spend their formative years in the United States and Europe. And so when the going got tough, it was very difficult for them to leave Iran, but they can sustain themselves outside of Iran. This current cartel, they spend their formative years in the seminaries of Qom, on the battlefield with Iraq. And people have said from the very beginning, they're not going to leave Iran without much more bloodshed. Ayatollah Khamenei is not going to be retiring to the south of France anytime soon. Another point I would make just in terms of the leadership is that Mousavi is not Khomeini, and Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei, is not the Shah, and that simply means that whereas I think Khomeini was quite ideological in his worldview and willing to risk the death of tens of thousands of people to martyrdom. You can tell with this current crop of leaders, with Mousavi, Khatami, Karoubi, it weighs much more heavily for them to send people out into the streets to be slaughtered. And I think that's why, again, they've taken a more deliberate approach. And then just to reiterate the point about Khamenei, one important lesson which they learned from the revolution was that when the Shah came out in late 1978 and he apologized on national television for past sins and transgressions and said, "I've heard the voice of your revolution," he thought that was going to appease or pacify the crowds. But on the contrary, that's when they smelled blood, they sensed he was weak, and they pounced. And so what you've noticed from Khamenei is that he hasn't given 1 inch because he believes if he compromises, he projects weakness. Just a minute or two on U.S. policy options. I thought Ray and Ruel laid out the options very well. I also think that sanctions are not a policy we can hang our hat on. It's not that they're going to be painless for the regime. They're going to be painful, and they have been painful. But this regime has never held the economic well-being of the Iranian people as either a first, second, or third-tier priority, meaning they've been willing to endure what we've seen the last 3 decades, is that they've been willing to endure enormous economic difficulties in order to sustain or continue forward with their ideology. This is a regime which prolonged the war with Iraq for 6 years for political expediency. So I think they're going to be willing to endure sanctions. So sanctions are going to be painful, but are they going to, I don't think that they're going to really change the nuclear calculations of this current cartel. In terms of a military option, this is not a throwaway comment when I say that I think that a military strike would be something welcomed by this current cartel, namely Ahmadinejad and Khamenei. I think it would obviously change the discussion domestically. And I think Tom Friedman makes a good point always. He says, I don't want to talk about the day after, let's talk about the day after the day after. Meaning, I agree that after 6 months or so, the conversation amongst the population is going to go back to the daily problems of life, inflation, unemployment, etc. It's not going to focus on Israel. It's not going to unite this population behind Ahmadinejad. But the point is that we need to continue to accentuate these rifts amongst the security apparatus, amongst the clerical elite. And I think a military strike would not do that, on the contrary. The most compelling option I've seen, most compelling policy prescriptions I've seen, are from an economist at George Washington University called Hossein Askari, who wrote a series of pieces in the national interest, which I would recommend to you. And I'm not an economist, so I can't give justice to his prescriptions, but basically he was talking about creating a run on the Iranian currency, on the rial. And there's ways of doing that. It's artificially valued vis-a-vis the dollar right now. And I think this would be by far more detrimental to the regime than the sanctions currently be discussed. The last point I would make is to reiterate the first point I made, and that is that the problem we have with this regime has to do with the character of it, not its nuclear ambitions. So the policies we should think about implementing should, at best, kind of facilitate this path to reform, but certainly do nothing to either deter its prospects or alter its trajectory. Thanks.
Thanks, Kareem. Time is very short. I'm going to ask one brief question to each of the three, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Ray, I wanted you to describe the mood inside the Obama administration after June the 12th, when it saw that its best-laid plans for engagement had hit a few bumps in the road. For Roll, I wanted to ask you how we are supposed to support the democracy movement in that country without undermining it in the way that many suggest that Bush policies did. And for Kareem, you spoke of links with the diaspora. I also mentioned this and noted that we're seeing these links again in a way that we haven't seen since '79. Again, how best to accentuate these links in a way to accentuate the rifts in the regime?
I think after June 12th, there was a sort of a perceptible deflation of hope. So you kind of saw. Nobody was quite sure how this was going to unfold because it's still unfolding. But before and after, I mean, June 12th was one of those sort of a cataclysmic moments that changes things. It was right there you saw this is not an ordinary development. This is not the student riots of 1999. Things were not, you weren't going to go back to June 11th. So the question was, you were as in uncharted waters. Where do you go from here? And what do you do then? And that became a subject of some degree of discussion. But I think there was certainly the optimism of, I think, March and May and that period began to fade.
I don't suppose you'd tell us what was in the letter that Khamenei sent back after Obama's first letter.
We have had a lot of communications back and forth, but there's been nothing operational.
Nothing operational, what do you mean?
I mean, there's nothing you can act upon.
Okay.
Well, I actually think, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm not sure it's a difficult question to answer. The Bush administration's early approach of having this sort of open democracy support inside of Iran never made a lot of sense to me. It always seemed like a one-way ticket to Haven prison. It's up for the dissidents to decide. I mean, that's always the case. I mean, I think we need to get our rhetoric straight. I think the president eventually did after June the 12th, but it took him a while to get there. I mean, just state very clearly, you are in favor of elections, you're in favor of honest elections, you're in favor of liberal principles. We shouldn't be bashful about those. We should, articulate them somewhat forcefully. Now, when it comes to direct support, that, again, I think is up to the Iranians involved. And I don't think it's our job to play Big Brother there. It's not our job to say you'll get hurt. It's not our job. I think there's a certain operational job when it comes to, say, clandestine support, that we're all adults and we need to look at it and figure out whether we can actually do, if some Iranians come to us and want us to do this, we have to figure out whether we can actually do something. But the rhetorical part, I think, is fairly easy. We'll have to wait and see whether there is an added dimension to that, whether there is a clandestine dimension. I certainly wouldn't be aggressive in generating on our own. I think it's up to Iranians to come to us and make suggestions. And if they make suggestions, then I think we shouldn't run away from them. And then the Obama administration would have to decide whether they want to get involved. I suspect they wouldn't. But at a minimum, we just need to get the rhetoric right. We need to be consistent about it and say quite clearly that the current government is illegitimate.
Okay, great.
I think I mentioned that there's been incredible proliferation of contacts between kind of the individuals who were once in the reformist camp, or even the moderate, pragmatic, conservative camp, and those Iranians in the diaspora, which hadn't taken place. One thing that's been interesting is that whereas in the past, I think they were all kind of almost unequivocally opposed to any type of punitive measures from the United States, sanctions, things like that. That's not the case anymore. They discuss with us kind of which punitive measures they feel could be helpful. They want to synchronize policies with the United States and with the appearance. Domestically within Iran, the leadership of the opposition is going to continue to say they're opposed to sanctions and things like that, but privately they send smaller signals. And I was kind of joking with one of them, saying that I said to him, now you're an outsider as well, like us. You're no longer an insider, you're an outsider. And he said, no, now we're all insiders, and the country is being ruled by the outsiders.
Okay. Let me take 3 questions, because I think we're going to go. Is it okay if we go maybe five minutes over? Okay. Raise your hand, identify yourself, and I don't know, are there microphones, or do you just have to shout? There are microphones. Okay. In the back with the beard. This guy, yeah.
Hi, Matt Duff, Center for American Progress. One of the most interesting things coming out of the post-election demonstrations was the extent to which the clerical establishment has kind of shown fissures and supported the free, fair elections and the rights of the demonstrators. And last week we saw a pretty strong statement from Ayatollah Montazeri, the prominent clerical dissident, calling on clerics to reject the regime. What are the implications of this, do you think, for the Green Movement moving forward, and possibly for kind of Islamist resistance more broadly in the Middle East?
Okay. Let's see. Gentleman over here who's holding up the white piece of paper.
Michael Allen with the National Endowment for Democracy. A number of observers in recent weeks have stressed that the Revolutionary Guards and, for that matter, the Basiji are not politically monolithic, and that they are potential, at least, as fractured as the clerical establishment. But recent events have not really exhibited any schisms within the Revolutionary Guards. In fact, other analysts have said that they've consolidated their power within the regime. What are the prospects for the security services splitting, particularly if they opt for what Ray Taki called Plan B and accentuate the repressive strategy?
Okay, and we'll take one more. Let's see. Is there another one? The lady who just raised her hand there.
Good morning. Are we on? Well, good morning. My name is Marketa Huskava, and I'm a grad student at the Masters of Arts in International Administration. And my question is relatively simple. While for us the nuclear issue of Iran is a thing for negotiation or debate, for Israel it's a thing of survival. So if the Obama administration is taking the step back to being the negotiator, and if Israel will take a step forward, and what if Israel does go through with some form of attack, what would be the steps the Obama administration is willing to take in either to support such step or to, well, I guess not support it. Thank you.
Sure. Kareem, why don't you do the clerical establishment maybe rule? Do you want to do the splits in the security services, and we'll let Ray be the cleanup on Israel?
With regards to the rifts amongst the clerical establishment, it's significant, but it's not fatal. Though Khamenei is himself a cleric, he's much more the leader, I would describe, of a military junta more than a clerical junta. And what would be fatal for him is not continued rifts amongst the clergy, but public rifts amongst the security elite and Revolutionary Guardsmen. And I would just say, with regards to that question, that Khamenei appoints the first, second, third-tier commanders of the Revolutionary Guards. So that's about 100, 150 people. So they're going to remain loyal to him. But amongst the rank and file of the Revolutionary Guards, I've heard from people within the Revolutionary Guards that they would estimate that a good half of them, if not a majority, voted for Mousavi. When and if things become more tumultuous, I don't think that they're going to turn on their counterparts, but I don't think they're going to be willing to continue to participate in this crackdown.
The security services, it's very difficult to get a proper assessment of them because they're, needless to say, not very open. I don't know. I mean, my good friend Benab Hukad, I think, was probably right when he was traveling in Iran and was with Revolutionary Guard Corps members, and he was saying that this was at the time that Khatami was running for election, that he had a lot of support amongst the Guard Corps. The Guard Corps is a huge institution now, and I suspect that it doesn't have a cohesive ideology that much anymore. There are those who are diehard believers, and then there are those who are just utterly corrupt, and then there are those who just want the natural perks that come with being members of the Guard Corps. So I'm very skeptical that the institution can take a lot of pressure. And we know with the Ministry of Intelligence that there are real fissures in it. So I'm not at all optimistic that the security services themselves think that they are solid, and I suspect that Khamenei is well aware that they don't want to have a really huge collision with a lot of people and have a lot of blood spilled. That's why in their actions they've tried to keep them off camera. They've tried to operate at night. They've tried to hit people in ways that would not graphically be displayed. So it's a big problem for them, and I don't know how they handle it. In the short term, they certainly have the muscle, but in the midterm, not even the long term, I'm somewhat more skeptical.
As I said, Israelis have to take a multitude of issues under consideration before they make one of the most important decisions since the '67 war. I suspect there isn't a whole lot of appetite for an Israeli strike, particularly in the United States military, because they view the successes that they've had in stabilizing Iraq and attempts to stabilize Afghanistan as being retarded by this particular issue, and that's the first and foremost consideration for them. So that's going to be an important audience. But how Israelis make their decisions and what they do and what factors they take into consideration, and among the factors has to be U.S.-Israeli relations and what that looks like the day after, the week after, the month after, and so forth. I really don't know. I mean, you can see an Israeli administration that's much more accommodating on the peace process as a result of that particular tension. But I just can't predict what they're going to do because I just don't know their anatomy and their considerations. I would say that what the Israelis, there isn't a politician in Israel that actually wants to do this. And they're hoping somehow that economic pressures or even diplomatic moves can work. I mean, there's not a lust or an appetite for a military action on the Israeli part. Everyone recognizes how difficult it's going to be and the problems that it will entail. So they're hoping somehow this issue is resolved, but it is unlikely to be resolved with the instruments that are available at this point.
Okay. I want to thank our speakers very much, and thank you all for